stage as well. First of all, just saying thank you for coming out on another sort of slightly cold evening, but I hope this evening to be able to give you a bit of a background to the Paul Scott exhibition and to just go through some of the pieces on show in a bit more detail. The show was actually brought to us, and it was curated by Jo Dahn, who some of you may have come across from Bath Bar Uni. So it's a show that we've done in collaboration with her, and it's actually going to be touring, which is quite an exciting thing for a Holburne show as well. So it's going to 4 venues after it's been here. It's on here until January, but then it will go to the Bowes Museum in County Durham, the Harley Art Gallery in Nottingham, the Aberystwyth Art Centre, before ending up in the Potteries, which I hope after this this talk you'll sort of see is a very fitting place for this show to end. And it's going to be part of what I hope is a really exciting series of shows in the ballroom, all focusing on ceramics, incidentally. So we're starting with this Paul Scott show, and then next year, in March, will be Nicholas Rena, followed by Michael Eden in the autumn. So we've got a really exciting kind of series of shows coming up, so and hopefully we'll be able to do more sessions about those as they come round. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of an introduction to Paul Scott. So here he is on screen, and this is a photograph of him actually in his kind of storage, I guess you could call it a shed, in Cumbria, which is where he's based. So you can see that he's surrounded by some of his amazing blue and white pieces. So Paul, as I said, is based in Cumbria. He started out looking at, or working on fine art really, from a sort of printmaking perspective, and really was drawn to ceramics through a love of surface decoration. And that's very much what his sort of practice looks at, is, you know, how you decorate things on the surface. And a lot of his work is really founded in, you know, some quite serious archival research as well. So it's a good thing it ends up looking so nice in the end, you know, that there's lots behind the scenes. Among other things, he's written quite a lot about the processes and techniques of printing, including in his book called Ceramics and Print, which is almost like a sort of practical how-to to people actually trying to learn to use these techniques, about which I'm going to talk a little bit more later on. So he's also been, you know, as well as being an artist, he's been a research fellow at Manchester University, and he's currently a professor at the National Academy of the Arts in Oslo. So, you know, he's quite a serious scholar, and that research really comes through in a lot of what he does. So this blue and white, you'll notice that it is quite familiar, and we keep talking about how familiar these motifs are. It's a 19th century decoration, really, that we're looking at. This is an example of a willow pattern plate. So it might just sort of look like a kind of familiar dinner plate that, you know, perhaps you've seen in charity shops or in your, you know, in your own homes, perhaps. And what it is it's got a bit of a history, a backstory, really. So it was in the 19th century that blue and white patterns like this were mass-produced for the first time. And essentially what they are is an imitation of Chinese porcelain for the Western market. It's a design which became known as the willow pattern. It's very familiar with its kind of, you can see it's got the 2 birds, the willow trees, figures on a bridge, and other motifs that you see repeated again and again. So it's true that the ceramics industry is a sort of a great area where China has sort of influenced the West and what was being produced. So the Europeans were trying to imitate Chinese-style porcelain for many centuries. Started out with doing sort of tin-glazed earthenware, not dissimilar to Maiolica here, but usually in a blue and white style, again, imitating Chinese porcelain. But it was in the 18th century that they invented the use of transfer printing, which is a term you'll hear again and again, and you'll see in a lot of Paul Scott's work. In the 19th century, that was kind of expanded and used to make just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of plates that were mass-produced in Stoke-on-Trent in the potteries. So they're often associated with Spode, which is a particular pottery brand, which was founded in the 1770s by Josiah Spode. It seems that everybody sort of pioneering in the 18th century was called Josiah, along with Wedgwood, but Spode are particularly associated with their use of transfer printing and mass production, and also by introducing bone china. And you'll notice that many of these pieces, I should just say that they are blue and white, but it's actually possible to transfer print in many, many different colours. But it's partly because of influence of China, and it's partly because cobalt blue just worked so well, and it looked very good, and it was easy to produce very striking images in that colour. Although, as we'll see, they're definitely not all blue. So these are just some images of the potteries, which is where much of this stuff was made. At the top, you can see an aerial view of the Spode factory in about 1927. And then at the bottom is just a picture from the 1930s of the bottle kilns that used to sort of dominate the skyline of Stoke-on-Trent, which is where the potteries industry was really based in this country, although it was, again, not the only place that these pieces were produced. So ceramics made in Stoke-on-Trent were exported all over the world, although, again, as we'll see, it's true that that transfer printed wares were actually made all over the world as well. So it's in ceramics, it's never as simple as things being exported to one place. You've got ideas going in one direction, you've got ceramics going in the other. It's all a very complicated sort of back and forth. So the potteries sort of pioneered many different kind of feats of engineering. So it might just look like a sort of ordinary jug that you can see on the left, which is a transfer printed blue and white jug. But it's actually a 30-gallon jug. So it's a kind of showpiece, really, that was made by a company called Bourne, Baker and Bourne for their shop in London. So a bit like the Giuseppe Plura upstairs, it was a kind of showpiece to go in the window to kind of show the world what kind of extraordinary things they were making. And the major advantage that transfer printing had is that it allowed you to produce very high-quality decoration without hand painting. So it was much, much quicker to produce than anything that would have been painted by hand. So this jug from about 1830, I've shown it side by side a picture of a man working at the Wedgwood factory in the 19th century. In the 20th century, obviously, it's a photograph, actually peeling off a transfer print from a copper plate. So I'm going to show you a picture which I hope shows you a bit more clearly how the process actually worked. So this is actually, I'm cheating slightly because it's a display at the V&A. It's a case which is actually, what it shows is a roller from the Spode factory, which basically is, they've taken the engraving, they've engraved it onto this roller. Often these would be copper, but sometimes they used other metals as well. It was then, the ink would have been sort of squeezed into the gaps in your metal plate, and then the pattern printed onto the tissue that you can see sort of on the front of the image. So there you can see how the patterns appear when they're flat and are then stuck on with glue onto the edge of a plate, which is then put in the kiln, and in the kiln, the pattern that was printed onto the paper and glued onto the plate, the paper burns away and you're left with this sort of pattern imprinted onto the body of the ceramic. So that's basically how you do a transfer print. And as you can see, they had to be very clever about how they angled it all so that you could put it onto a curved surface. There'd be people in the factories sponging these designs, sponging their sort of cutouts of tissue paper onto the ceramic. So just one other technical thing to say here is that if you imagine the dish when the person was about to put the transfer print on it, it would have been fired once. So it would have been through what's called a biscuit firing. And then it would have been, the tissue paper would have been pasted on, and then it would have been glazed. So this decoration is underglaze, but you often hear that term used in ceramic as well. It just basically means that it's not been glazed before the pattern was put on. Now, I hope that's given you a bit of background to kind of the potteries industry, and in particular blue and white. I'm going to talk a bit more about Paul's work. So what I hope to do this evening is basically take you on a sort of virtual tour actually around the table. So the idea is, as you go into the ballroom, and starting with what you see as you first go in and basically walking around the table. And I'm hoping to sort of give you a bit of a background to each of the pieces and just hopefully some talking points. And just say there will be time for questions at the end, so I hope if you think of something, you'll save it up for that. So the first piece that we're looking at is a willow pattern dish, but as you can see, it's been through the wars a little bit. So this willow pattern piece is actually called Fukushima, and it's part of a series that Paul Scott worked on after the Fukushima disaster, where essentially this tidal wave destroyed the nuclear factory, and we're still seeing effects in Japan now. So there are a couple of things to note about this plate, really. The first is that it's a willow pattern plate, so basically, essentially exactly the same pattern as the one I showed you earlier, except this one was actually made in Japan, which is quite unusual. There are not that many examples. This is from about 1965, so it gives you an idea. The first plate I showed you was from about 1818, and this one's from 1965, so the pattern has changed, hardly at all, even though it was produced at the other end of the world. Obviously, you'll notice that there's a great big wave coming through this, which you might recognise as being from the Japanese woodcut prints by Hokusai. So that, again, has a kind of extra layers of meaning, and I think you'll find that throughout Paul's work, really. So the reason that this plate has cracks all over it is because, well, there are two reasons. One is, I suppose, logically, conceptually, the idea that the landscape was broken by this wave. It's really this tragic accident. But the other reason is that Paul ordered this online from eBay, from a seller, who put it in a jiffy bag and sent it to him with no additional packing. So it arrived in pieces. And I think Paul was noted to me, really, that they couldn't have chosen a better person to badly pack their ceramics for, because he was actually, unlike most people, able to do something with that and use it to make this new piece in response to the Fukushima disaster. The other thing to say is that the wave is actually from a completely different plate. So he didn't just sort of cut out the wave section from this willow pattern plate. He got another willow pattern plate and removed the decoration and put the wave on it himself. So, and you'll see that often that some of the decoration is Paul kind of doing his own thing and adding things, and some of it is taken directly from other plates without sort of altering them. The other thing I'm just going to point out is that you can see some radioactive symbols in the border here. Because I realised that I put that in the labels, but actually there's only one piece in the show that has radioactive symbols in the border, and this is it. So even though it's on the other side from where the text actually says that. So I hope you'll be able to encourage visitors to look at the radioactive symbols here. And of course, it's topically, it makes sense that it's in the Fukushima plate because it's about a nuclear disaster. So moving on to another piece, which is from a series that Scott calls Arctic Scenery. This particular plate is called Kuluk, which is the name of the oil rig that you can see on it. So this is quite a different process and quite a different technique to the first plate I've just shown you, the Fukushima plate. Well, A, it's not broken, and B, you can see that it doesn't have sort of any other sort of old decoration on it. What we're actually looking at is a collage of different motifs that Paul has put together. So the middle, you have this Arctic rig, which is from a photograph. The reason that he's sort of chosen to show this is because it's really a commentary on the fact that we're told, time and again that drilling in the Arctic is perfectly safe. But what this actually shows is a rig that was being moved for tax purposes from one part of the Arctic to another, and it ran aground on an Arctic island, causing masses of sort of ecological problems. I think you'll see that tone of sort of wry observation, or possibly sort of righteous anger, depending on how you interpret it, in a lot of Paul's work. And so I've talked about the picture in the middle here. We've also got some islands, which are actually taken from the willow pattern designs. And then the sea, which is kind of rising over the bottom half of the plate, which is from Paul's own designs. So he actually takes motifs from all kinds of different areas, and they are sort of collaged onto the piece. So even if the plate itself isn't an actual collage, and we'll look at some of those in a minute, the motifs often are, because what he does is he creates the transfers, which he can then put on any plate. So one of the things to say about this is that you'll notice it's quite blank in comparison to the decorated plates. And that's because in his work, Paul uses what's actually called blanks a lot. So they are basically pieces that went through the first firing in the factory. They're biscuit fired, but then the decoration was never put on. Many factories actually sold blanks in large numbers to other factories to be decorated. So in Paul's work, he's been able to kind of capitalise on those, buying blank ones, which he can then completely use as a sort of a blank canvas for his own designs. Here are two further plates that kind of explore similar ideas. The one at the top left is called Fract, and the one at the bottom right is a wind turbine piece. And they all look at the idea of the horizon and the things that we're doing to the horizons and the landscape around us. Another thing to say is that you'll notice in the bottom piece here, the wind turbine piece, there are lots of sort of speckles on the surface. And that's because when Paul actually puts his decoration on, whatever his intervention will be, all the pieces need to be refired so that the reactions of the glaze can happen. And when you refire an old piece, sometimes the impurities that are inside it, perhaps from it being used, the meat juices he was referring to, which I thought was quite funny, but apparently it's really true. If people put lots of the juices of whatever was served on plates would have kind of snuck into the crazing and the glaze and eventually leave a mark, and then they burn out in the kiln. And so you get these kind of unexpected patterns that really sort of reveal the history of the plate that you perhaps hadn't known was under the surface. I think one thing to say is that although you might be interested to know that Paul actually really likes wind farms, so they're not all totally negative, but it's, I suppose, an observation that not everybody is a massive fan. So most of the examples we've seen so far are looking at sort of landscape scenery, and here we've got some more examples of UK and American scenery, including a piece called Chapel Cross, which is on the top right. And then here we've got a piece where sort of masses of electrical lines are sort of dominating this sort of idyllic landscape. And again, you'll see that these are kind of entirely Paul's own creation on blank surfaces. So what we're looking at the bottom, it is a toilet cistern. The reason that this is included is because one of Paul's recent projects was in Canada, and he actually went to some of the abandoned factories in the Alberta area of Canada, because basically after about the 1970s, Canada wasn't competitive in its ceramics industry. And unlike in the UK, probably because we have a lot less space, when a factory closes down here, it tends to kind of perhaps be deserted for a while, and then it's knocked down or turned into something else, redeveloped. In Canada, that hasn't happened. So you've got these factories in this very bleak, flat landscape. Perhaps I shouldn't call it bleak. I haven't even been there, so I don't know. But very flat landscape. So what Paul did was he actually went to these factories where everything was just left, all the ceramics, because they essentially had no value after the factory had closed. And so he was able to salvage pieces and again use them as these sort of blank canvases for his own work. And so many of Scott's pieces are actually interventions into things that were already decorated. This is an example very much commenting on this kind of idealized pastoral vision that you often see in blue and white ceramics. This is an interesting example because it's actually a Swedish plate and a Swedish design. But it could be sort of anywhere. But it's an interesting example that that shows really that a lot of these designs were sort of how should we say, appropriated by different countries. So even though the origins might well be American or British or wherever, they very easily adapted these designs for new places and then felt that they had ownership of it. So, you know, this could be anywhere, but it's actually Sweden. To come on to another area, and again, we are still continuing around the table, so I hope you'll, you know, notice that, you know, we can virtually be walking around the table at the moment. This is one of the sort of not digital collages that we've looked at before, but physical collages. So where Paul has taken two plates and actually kind of collaged them together. So the gold that he uses is a reference to the Japanese techniques of basically mending ceramics in a very visually obvious way, because there's a feeling that ceramics had a value beyond their sort of cultural value and beyond their sort of monetary value. Actually mending a piece and making that very obvious and using expensive materials and very skilled techniques to do so was a way of adding to that object's history. So the break is part of the object rather than you know, something that you want to hide and disguise. The idea for these collage pieces really came from a place where, experimenting with the different patterns, he suddenly realised that a lot of the landscapes lined up. So even though they were essentially 19th century copies of earlier Chinese landscapes, you find that they all kind of fit together in this strange way. You know, the trees are at the same level, the horizon is in the same place. And that's an idea that he explored in a lot of these collage pieces that we'll look at now. One of the first collage pieces that he made was this one, which was called Bridgeless. I should say that these collage pieces are extremely recent. They were actually all from 2014. And although I probably shouldn't tell you this, he was finishing some of them last week. You know, they really are his very latest work. The two plates that you can see on screen are both called Bridgeless, because one of them, well, as you can see, one of them has lots of bridges and one of them has no bridges. I think, if that's the right one, I'm suddenly doubting myself and wondering whether they're actually bridges. But no, all the bridges are in the one on the right. And this is a bit of an in-joke, really, with the idea that collectors of transferware had, you know, they often knew the names of all these very obscure patterns from all these different factories, but actually would sort of invent names for certain types of decoration. So there were certain kinds of willow pattern that didn't have bridges in, and so they called them bridgeless, even though there isn't a pattern called bridgeless. And so you find people selling and buying bridgeless plates, which I think Paul found particularly interesting. You know, as somebody who himself is quite sort of obviously passionate about blue and white ceramics himself, although perhaps coming from a slightly different angle. So this one works quite well as a collage because, you know, it's a pair because the two plates are really, parts of them are interchanged, but not all of them exactly work like that. So the next group are some other collages where, you know, it's not that the two parts slot together in a sort of perfect way from two different plates, but they're actually sort of separate pieces in their own right. But of course, he never actually get rid of the other half that he didn't use immediately because, and I can vouch for the fact that his studio is very, very full of fragments of all kinds, all shapes and sizes, all materials. One of the things that I hope you'll sort of find interesting about these three plates is that, unlike some of the other pieces, they actually combine different materials. So they're really a comment on sort of landscape painting tradition. So as I was saying with ceramics, we were copying what China was doing. Well, the same with landscape painting. And these collages actually combine Chinese porcelain, which is hand-painted. So this is hand-painted Chinese porcelain, as is this. But this is transfer-printed earthenware. So completely different material, completely different time period, in fact, because the Chinese porcelain is hand-painted basically in the 18th century, and the transfer plates are transfer-printed in the 19th century. And yet, again, you find these landscapes sort of follow on from each other. The horizon's in the same place, and it really emphasises the connections that sort of exist between things made at different periods. Continuing around the table, I've got another piece. This is called After the Bypass, and it's part of a sort of a vein of Scott's work that really looks at, how these idealised landscapes are completely misleading, and how often, in fact, we'd see them from a car, from the bypass. That's where we see these idealised landscapes, but we're perhaps forgetting that there is a bypass in the picture too. And again, a series of work from America, including this piece, which is a Port Merion platter showing the New Jersey Turnpike. So again, the idea of sort of how we actually see the landscape as sort of people who exist in it. One of the get my paper in the right order. The next thing I'm going to talk about is this. I realise my other image has disappeared. Well, it was supposed to be an example of from our collection, actually, of a piece that was mended in this way. So I'm sorry, we'll just have to imagine that one. But here you can see another of the pieces sort of salvaged from Paul's excursion to a deserted Canadian ceramics factory. And in this case, it was actually a broken plate, which you can see he's sort of gilded along one broken edge and then mended with rivets. So this process literally involves drilling into the plate and then using metal sort of staples to hold the ceramics. So no glue at all is used in this process. It's actually how ceramics have been repaired for many centuries, except normally it's on the back, so you can't see it. But obviously here it's front and centre, very much part of the design. So not all of the blue and whites that you see are willow patterns. There are just an infinite number of different patterns. And I'll come back to that when we're talking about the table runner. But again, you see this kind of recurring theme in Scott's work about the idea that we're sort of kidding ourselves about what the landscape really looks like. So here we have some small interventions into on the left an Alfred Meakin plate from the 60s. He's added a wind turbine and a low-flying jet. And in the Davenport dish from about 1850, he's added another jet, which perhaps wouldn't have been there at that day, but more likely to be there now. So, and then this is a jug from about 1930, one of the few examples of seriously coloured pieces, because most of the, as you'll have noticed, most of the pieces on the show are actually blue and white. But again, that sort of minimal intervention of adding a jet just kind of shifts the perspective a little bit. So I'm returning to some of the use of blanks in Scott's work. He's shown some scenes from very local, of local issues that have affected him being resident in Cumbria. So at the top left, you can see a collage of, which is a reference to the fact that Cumbria was seriously affected by the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001. So when I suppose you look at that, it kind of slightly shifts the perspective of what you're looking at here, because you realise it's the kind of carnage of that disaster and what it meant for the countryside. And yet, just a couple of years later, at the bottom right, you see an area called Watchtree where animals are grazing again, but they're essentially walking on the graves of hundreds of thousands of carcasses that were buried under there. But yet, 3 years on, you really can't tell that that's the sort of animal graveyard to sort of end all animal graveyards. And those, one of the nice things about Paul's process is that when he's actually working with different images, he always thinks very hard about copyright and ownership of those images. And that often results in actually him doing swaps. So he took some iconic photographs by MacLeod, Darwell and May of the foot and mouth outbreak and used those to make digital collages, and then sort of did swaps with those photographers so that they could have some of his work in exchange for him using their work in his own pieces. And in a sense, that's how he sort of pays for his use of digital photography whenever possible. Because I suppose you can't really imagine somebody who was so sort of fascinated by the origin of images not sort of taking copyright issues in the 21st century seriously. Then a local issue, the Sellafield factory. So this is a screen print on a large sort of platter which was originally undecorated. So the whole decoration here is Paul is Paul doing his thing, and again juxtaposing that kind of industrial wasteland with the landscape. And one of the things that he pointed out to me about this is that this is a prime example of neat juices coming out without you realizing what it is. So he'd actually done this cloud as part of his design, but all of this kind of mist in the background is totally accidental result of it coming out of the kiln, and these kind of whatever was ingrained in the body of the ceramic kind of coming out under that high temperature in the firing. So this is from a series called the Decommissioning series about Sellafield Nuclear Power Station, and a couple of little anecdotes about this one that have come to mind. One being that you'll notice the bird on the rim there, which again is Paul's addition, and it represents one of the pigeons that became quite famous for a few weeks after the closure of the decommissioning, I should say, of the nuclear power station, because it was found that these two local women had been feeding pigeons, and they were becoming a bit of a health risk. And somebody sort of said, apparently, I mean, I have no idea whether this is totally apocryphal, but I'm prepared to believe it. Apparently, when the RSPCA were sort of looking into these these pigeons overrunning the countryside near Sellafield, a passing kind of resident commented that they were radioactive, those pigeons. And of course, once you've said the word radioactive, they had to do all the tests, and it turned out they actually were. So that's quite an extraordinary story. And again, a sort of the idea of whatever we're doing, however safe it may be, it has perhaps unexpected consequences that we could never have foreseen. The other thing that I think is quite entertaining about this piece really is that one of the decommissioning Sellafield series was actually bought by the nuclear company and was on display in their boardroom. So don't know what you make of that. I hope I've given you a sense of the breadth of some of Scott's influences. These two pieces, in a way, show that quite nicely because there are two cows in meadows. You can see the meadow on each plate there. And the cow at the bottom is after Thomas Bewick engraving of a cow. So Thomas Bewick was a sort of late 18th century, early 19th century English engraver and natural history writer, and he illustrated all kinds of species and no least cows. So this is one of his drawings. And at the top you've got a cow that's sliced as a sort of homage to Damien Hirst's sliced cows. But again, a very sort of an interesting sign of how the willow pattern kind of gets everywhere without you really noticing, because quite what a sort of countryside scenery image is doing on the side of the cow is well, it's a question I am asking. I think they do show that kind of level of humour that's sometimes present in Scott's work, which I hope sort of looking at his pieces will kind of bring out. The piece on the top left, is in the show as well, and it's another collage plate. The piece on the right is another Spode plate, which is not in the show, but it's just to show you what Spode's other very famous design that we'll kind of start seeing everywhere now that you've looked at it once. It's called Spode's Italian, or it's also known as Blue Italian, and in a way it's like the main rival for the willow pattern in terms of being the most sort of widely used blue and white pattern ever. It was in production from 1816 at Spode until the factory closed in 2009. That whole time it was a massive bestseller for the factory. And Essentially what you can see here is it's split with another plate, and I think exploring the different patterns of Spode Italian is something that we'll see in the next few examples of Paul's work. So just some examples of some of the places you might see Spode Italian, produced on kind of all sorts of wares. In this piece it's actually collaged with the wild rose pattern to create a piece called Wild Italian. So you'll often find that there are sort of witty title references, so it's always worth kind of looking at that and sort of thinking about where those names might have come from. So I said that Spode Italian was in production until, God, that looked really wonky, I can't tell. The Spode Italian was produced at the factory from the early 19th century until the factory closed in 2009, and that sort of closure inspired another series of work from Paul called the Spode Works Closed series, of which this is one piece. So just to say one thing about this platter, which is that it's an extraordinarily unusual thing because it's fired and it's literally half finished. You might find things that have some decoration or just a border or something like that, but this piece would never have left the factory looking like this under any circumstances, even to be sold, as for another factory to decorate. And the reason for that is you'd either have sort of no border, as on this half, and nothing in the middle, or the full border. But this is basically representing the exact moment when Spode closed, because it basically means that the person that was making this, who would have been working by piecework, so the number of pieces that they actually finished, literally finished their shift halfway through the piece and stopped, and then Spode was closed forever. So it's really capturing that kind of quite extraordinary moment, really, given that the pattern had been, as I said, in continuous production for 150, well, 250. Yeah, I need to count my centuries. Sorry about that. For so many years, and so the addition of gilding, I guess, is Scott's way of kind of emphasising that story and kind of giving it a sort of slightly different look. But you'll notice that there is a little symbol here that he's added, which in this piece is actually the only change that he's actually made, where apart from the gilding, which is it says Spode closed. So it's the kind of iconic Spode symbol with the word closed written across it. So in a sense, you come full circle here, because we're looking at Spode Italian combined with the willow pattern. So the two kind of most iconic designs have come together. And in a sense, it's nice because you can actually see the connections here. You can see why the willow pattern was thought to be what Chinese stuff looked like, basically. Whereas this is the kind of much more European version of it. But essentially, they actually are not that dissimilar. But here you've got these kind of crisscross dice patterns, which you would see on lots of hand-painted Chinese wares, and much more sort of stylized trees and things. Whereas here it's all looking much more European in style. Now, this is another piece which uses the willow pattern as a base for quite a strong political statement. It's called A Willow for Ai Weiwei, and it was made at the time when Ai Weiwei's show at the Tate Modern opened, and his sunflower seeds were suddenly everywhere, but he was nowhere to be seen because his political artworks were deemed unacceptable by the Chinese government. And so it's a reference to the fact that Ai Weiwei had disappeared at that time. So here, along with all the other figures that you normally see in a willow pattern piece, they've all disappeared, they've gone. Here's a gap, people are missing from the boat, and Ai Weiwei himself is missing. So this kind of slightly blurry outline, I should just explain, is taken from a screenshot of Ai Weiwei dropping a sort of priceless Han urn. And you can see Paul has actually added the urn right there. Essentially, that screenshot, Paul has disappeared him, so you just have his outline, and that's why it's sort of a blank space around that. And again, the addition of all his sunflower seeds in here as well. but essentially the figures disappeared, and not just Ai Weiwei, but some of his companions as well. And I'll talk about that in a minute when I come on to looking at back stamps. But the reason that Paul made this is really a comment on the fact that he himself, working in this country, has political freedom to make the statements that he wants, and was suddenly painfully aware of the fact that that's not a universal right. So this is a tea service called sorry, I've completely forgotten what it's called. That's the Cockle Pickers Tea Service, that's the one. And it's a tea service which is actually made from a number of different pieces, all made from different factories. So you've got a Worcester teapot, a pearlware cup from the 1780s, and we've got, we're really lucky actually to have a real selection of works from this series, because it's the one of three that were made by Scott, but actually the other two are in museums. So we've got the last one, and I think the reason that this kind of relates to that political strand of Scott's work is that it's about the tragedy in Morecambe Bay in 2004, when 23 Chinese cockle pickers, hence Cockle Pickers Tea Service, were drowned in Morecambe Bay. And this is quite a strong statement really on the idea of slavery, because, well, on the left you can see a jasperware medallion which was made by Wedgwood, and so from 1787 Josiah Wedgwood was a leading member of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and he designed, manufactured and distributed many medallions like the one on the left. It's a kneeling slave in chains, and the caption around the top says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And they produced them also, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" versions as well. But you can just about make out inside the cup there is that symbol. So Scott's Cockle Pickers Tea Service is a very overt reminder that although slavery was abolished, people are still working in slavery in the modern day, as those Chinese workers in Morecambe Bay were when they were drowned. Comment is that, you know, in fact the reality of Palestine today is there's a wall separating Palestine from, separating Gaza, and there's destruction in yet another war in that region. It's interesting that these are one of the few examples of actually coloured wares. These are Adam's plates, but he's removed half of the decoration and added in these photo collages. So these are actually real scenes in Gaza in 2014 that he's collaged onto these plates, as a stark contrast to that kind of idealised land of palm trees and sort of exotic buildings. And that sort of commentary on sort of East and West and what the West thought the East looked like comes up here again. So this was a piece called Yanina, which was again thought to be Middle Eastern in many records, but actually is in Greece, and has a sort of Byzantine buildings here, which are actually, some of the motifs are similar to the Palestine motifs, but again, it's a kind of very sort of westernized view of what the East looked like, but again with a low-flying jet, which seems to be inescapable in Paul's landscapes. The next piece, this large platter in the show, is called Bombs Over Baghdad, and I think one of the things that I just want to flag up here is that you, just to say what Paul's actually done to the platter, which might not be that obvious initially, but he's actually added these borders from other patterns. So although they might not look completely out of place, what they do is they sort of show you what transfer prints look like if you tear them before you do it. So it makes you perhaps realise how technically, you don't notice the joins that often in transferware. And here he's highlighting the joins so that you can see that, and also as a sort of political commentary about the fact that Baghdad is not a sort of calm place right now. And he's also added figures swimming down the river, as they did when the city was being bombed in recently. I guess this is another example of you know, willow pattern meets willow pattern as just our final collage. I think just sort of show you in quite a clear way again what, you know, how far these designs travelled and how each one may look very similar but is very different from its kind of counterparts that are perhaps identical. So you'll also have noticed along the table that there's a little forest of trees. And these pieces are, again, taken, they're using sort of scenery borrowed from all kinds of different patterns. Again, I think you get quite a nice contrast between the sort of very stylized willow of the willow pattern and these other trees which are in the willow pattern, but then the European trees are, you know, hugely different in style. So I think I've been through everything on the table, and I'm just going to say a few more words about just some of the background to sort of where Paul's ideas are coming from. So what you can see here is, I'd love to say this is Spode, but it's actually Worcester. But it gives you a sense of how, in the factories, they actually use these transfers when they're creating their different patterns. So they have this whole massive archive. So these are basically pens filled with copper plates, which have all of the patterns that you could ever see on transfer printed wares. And so what Paul's done is really go to the archives of Spode, go to various ones in Scandinavia, different factories, and actually take prints from these copper plates, which he then incorporates into his work. So in a way, this is like a hidden side. You don't normally get to kind of see those processes behind the scenes. And in fact, it's these storage pens, although not literally these ones, because we don't have any pictures of the ones in Spode because the factory's closed, and it's very much under question what the future of that factory is, or of what that archive's future is, sorry. But in Spode, they all have these pattern names on the top of the pen that basically tells you what pattern's inside it. So it has all the copper plates for each pattern in a little pen. And it's these names that Paul became very kind of, you know, interested in. So this is actually a sort of collage photo that he made of a bunch of different ones. But what he actually did was put them all together in a great sort of long, kind of crazy epic poem in alphabetical order, all the names of all the Spode patterns. And he also added in some of the Rörstrand, Gustavsberg in Sweden, and Egersund in Norway. So if you notice a few Norwegian words, it's probably not Spode, it's one of those. But essentially, you can see some of the kind of crazy names, complete with typos and kind of all sorts of crazy spellings of things. Yeah, you can see how they spelt Delft in Spode. They didn't do spell checking in those days. And you can just reading this is kind of, it's quite a strange experience because you can see the connections, but then sometimes you just think, well, what on earth did that pattern look like? And sometimes we have examples and sometimes we don't. But this basically formed the basis for the table runner that's on the table and is the sort of basis for these pieces. And this is actually a couple of images of the table runner being printed. So it was printed at Bar Spa, it's printed on linen to Paul's design. So essentially that Word document I just showed you, which was all the names of every pattern at Spode, with a few Swedish and Norwegian ones thrown in, became this kind of printed table runner. I think, you know, it's an interesting because it provides that kind of textual background to Paul's work. You know, and it is so embedded in that research, which is basically where all the visual stuff has come from. So just to say a little something about the back stamps, which are in front of every piece in the show. So here you can see again the Willow for I Weiwei piece. This is what the back of the plate looks like, and it's reproduced in the book, but it gives you a sense of how much there is on the back of each of the pieces. And here is the label that Paul made for this show. So the reason that we have these labels is because it came out of conversation about not wanting viewers to basically miss out on all of this, because it gives so much context, so much extra sort of history, background, there are in-jokes, there's just so much sort of hidden in the back there. And I think this is a particularly nice example of that, because here we have Who's Afraid of Ai Weiwei, which is a poster that started appearing in Hong Kong when the artist was imprisoned, along with the title, A Willow for Ai Weiwei, and a seed, and then the names of Ai Weiwei's companions who disappeared at the same time as him, but who didn't get anything like the publicity, perhaps because they didn't have a show in the Tate at the time. But it's a sort of a reminder of the different people involved in those situations. Just to finish up, that the way that the information is kind of displayed in the show was really thinking about how there are so many layers to Paul's work. In a way, you can take in a first sort of visual look at what you're seeing, but there's always more beneath the surface. Whether that's on the back of the piece, whether that's in which collages he's put together, there's just always more to find out. And so we've tried to not sort of overdo the interpretation by having some kind of labels that introduce, the kinds of ideas that Scott's working with, as well as the back stamps, so that you can see what's on the reverse of the plates. We've also got large print labels and, of course, the publication, which will give you a lot more information. So, yeah, I think that's a bit of a gallivant around the table, but I'd be really happy to answer any questions and as best I can. So. Yes.
How does the cobalt? It's very technical. How does the cobalt blue get onto the ceramic?
Well, what happens is you essentially decide which image you want. You get an engraver to do an engraving of the image. You then, they would engrave that into a copper plate, usually. Then you get some ink on a roller, and you roll it over the copper plate. You then get tissue, or very thin paper, which you press at high pressure onto the ink engraving. You then peel it off, put it onto the plate, and at that point the plate is unglazed, which means that it basically has a sort of particular response. It's porous, exactly, and it kind of, it sticks. So you basically stick it on with glue, and then in the kiln, the high temperature that you're subjecting the piece to burns away the paper, leaving just the ink. Yeah, and it changes colour too. The other thing you'll notice is if you start seeing, if you see, and I should have put a picture in actually, but an unfired piece that has the decoration on, it looks a totally different colour. It looks kind of browny purple, usually cobalt, but then when you actually put it to the right temperature, it comes out this vivid blue colour. Well, he has a kind of vast array of tools in his studio. One being the porcelain saw. So it's it makes quite a loud noise, I'm told. It's the kind of kit you have to have goggles and all that. But you basically, it's like any normal saw, but it's strong enough to cut through porcelain, and it does that without kind of putting undue pressure on it, so it doesn't crack. And so he would have used a saw, obviously, to cut all the collage pieces and also the back stamp tiles. The last time I saw those tiles in Cumbria, they were sort of this size, and then he printed all of them and then cut them out on his porcelain saw. He uses a few other tools as well, including, for removing decoration, there's either a sandblaster, which I'm told is for the sort of bigger bits, if you're getting rid of half a plate's worth of decoration. And then there's also a dental drill for finer detail. Well, it's amazing how high-tech some of the digital processes are. So a lot of what he would do is take essentially print with the right sort of ink to actually put on the ceramic directly onto the tissue stuff. So you basically create digital. Sorry. No. He's taken his own prints from the copper plates for the historic ones. But when he's kind of transporting his own work, his own kind of drawings and stuff into, designs that can be put onto the ceramic, he doesn't need to actually engrave it because you can just digitally print that onto the paper. But you can actually, if you're interested in particularly interested in the technical side, his book is really worth a look because it explains the processes in quite a lot of detail. And we actually are stocking it in the shop. It's called Ceramics and Print. He does. Yes. The thing that's interesting is that he was saying that because a lot of these collage pieces are recent works, initially he was using things that were already broken. So it's only the very recent ones that he's actually deliberately cutting things. And yeah, I think it's not something that he's taken lightly, because they're not. Especially rare plates, they're not cheap, and it's not, I think it's going to be interesting to see how people respond to those collage plates in particular, because, his sort of interventions into the decoration has been something that he's been doing for quite some time, but actually cutting them is quite a different undertaking. So it'll be interesting if we've got, frenzied collectors being horrified at his damage of willow pattern plates and things. Well, I think the thing to say there is that, theoretically no, but I think, what I hope sort of clear from some of the stuff that I've been saying is that the history of the plates themselves is, as important as sort of what's on it. So, in a way it makes sense that when he's using, for instance, decorating a plate from the 1950s and actually making a comment on how we saw landscapes in the 1950s, there's always a connection with what the surface is, where possible, before he makes the choice about what to actually cut and what intervention to do.
Do you know if there's a reason why he uses the jet?
Well, I think it started out as the idea that it's a small thing, it's a simple thing that you might not notice, and yet it completely transforms how you see the landscape.
If his workshop is in Cumbria,
yeah,
that's where the RAF will.
Is it really? That's interesting. I didn't really think of that. Well, I'll have to ask him.
He is constantly.
Well, maybe that's why, subconsciously, he didn't mention that, but perhaps subconsciously it's just that every landscape he sees has a low-flying jet in it. Oh, that's great.
Very much.